Cheech and Chong are two of the most famous names in comedy history. Everyone knows the jokes about weed, the funny voices, and the movies that made an entire generation laugh until their stomachs hurt. But here is the truth that almost nobody talks about. Behind the smoke and the punchlines, there's a mountain of stories so strange, so shocking, and so unbelievable that even their biggest fans have never heard most of them. Today we are going deep into the hidden history of Cheech and Chong, and trust me, some of these facts are going to completely change how you see them. Stick with us until the very end, because the last fact on this list might be the wildest thing you learn all week. Let's start with something that almost nobody knows. Before Cheech Chong ever picked up a microphone, he was hiding from the government. During the late 1960s, young men across America were being sent to fight in the Vietnam War whether they wanted to go or not. Cheech did not want to go. He did not believe in the war, and he was terrified of what would happen if he got drafted. So he did something bold. He packed up his life and ran to Canada. Think about that for a second. One of the most beloved comedians in American history technically fled his own country to avoid being forced into war. He wasn't thinking about fame or fortune. He was thinking about survival. Before all of that, he had actually been enrolled in college, studying pottery of all things, spending his days learning about clay and kilns instead of punchlines and timing. He genuinely believed that pottery was going to be his future. He pictured himself running a small studio somewhere quiet, shaping bowls and vases, completely unaware that fate had a much louder and much funnier plan waiting for him. Once he crossed the border into Canada, that dream had to be put on hold. He took whatever jobs he could find just to get by, driving trucks and hauling carpets across town, or while quietly working on pottery on the side whenever he had a spare moment, because that was still his real passion before comedy ever entered the picture. If the draft had never happened, there is a good chance Cheech Chong would have spent his whole life as a potter instead of a movie star, quietly selling handmade ceramics at local markets instead of selling out theaters across the country. Comedy was never even part of the plan. It found him completely by accident, in a city he never intended to live in, doing a job he only took because he needed rent money. And here's a detail that makes the whole thing even stranger. The club where he eventually found Tommy Chong wasn't some elegant comedy venue with a stage and a spotlight. It was a topless bar in Vancouver's Chinatown called the Shanghai Junk, and Cheech didn't walk in looking for a comedy career at all. He walked in looking for any job that would pay him enough to survive. Tommy Chong happened to be running the place at the time, and instead of a normal strip club, he had turned it into something strange and experimental, blending burlesque dances with little improved comedy sketches performed in between routines. It was a mashup nobody else was doing, and it just so happened to be exactly the kind of unusual environment where two mismatched personalities could collide and discover something neither of them expected. Their very first big laugh together wasn't even planned. It came from an unscripted bit about a guy searching for his friend Dave, where the punchline was simply that the other guy was too stoned to remember Dave was standing right there. Nobody wrote it down beforehand. It just happened live in front of an audience, and the crowd went wild. That single unscripted moment became the spark that convinced two total strangers they might actually have something special together. And speaking of accidents, here is something that will really mess with your head. The most famous line in Up in Smoke, the one where the duo is smoking a joint the size of a baseball bat, was almost never in the movie at all. Early test audiences and studio executives were nervous about how far the film pushed things. Several studios actually turned the project down before it ever got made because they thought a movie built entirely around getting high was too risky and too controversial to release. Executives worried it would get banned, boycotted, or simply ignored by mainstream theaters who did not want to be associated with drug humor. Some of them thought the whole concept was career suicide, not just for the studio but for anyone attached to it. Think about that. One of the highest-grossing comedy films of its era, a movie that basically created an entire genre of stoner comedy, almost never made it to theaters because nobody believed in it. It took a smaller, more daring producer willing to take the gamble to finally get it off the ground. Someone who saw what the biggest studios refused to see, that audiences were hungry for something different and rebellious. Without that one risk-taker, the whole Cheech and Chong legacy, as we know it, might not exist, and an entire generation of comedy that followed in their footsteps might have looked completely different too. Here is a fact that a lot of people never connect to Cheech and Chong at all. Before they were known purely as movie stars, they were actually a massive force in the music industry. Their comedy albums were not just side projects thrown together for a quick laugh, they were genuine chart-topping hits. One of their records even won a Grammy Award, something most fans have completely forgotten or simply never knew in the first place. At their peak, they were selling millions of copies of spoken-word comedy albums, competing directly with real musicians on the charts. It's wild to think about now. Two guys sitting in a studio riffing on stoner characters actually outselling serious musicians during parts of the 1970s. That success on the music side is part of what gave them the leverage to eventually break into film in the first place. Without those chart-topping albums proving there was a real audience hungry for their brand of comedy, studios might never have taken a chance on giving them a movie at all. Now here's a twist that sounds like something out of a horror movie itself. Cheech and Chong were almost cast in a real Friday the 13th film. Picture this in your head for a second. Jason Voorhees, the terrifying killer in the hockey mask, stumping through the woods, and suddenly he stumbles across two laid-back stoners who have no idea they just wandered into a slasher movie. That was an actual pitch made to the studio behind the franchise. The director behind one of the Friday the 13th sequels thought it would be hilarious and completely unexpected to throw the two comedy legends directly into the middle of a horror story, either as clueless campers or as guys secretly running a weed farm in the woods where Jason hunts his victims. It never actually happened, but just imagine how different pop culture would look today if that crossover had gotten made. A slasher movie and a stoner comedy smashed together into one chaotic film. It's almost too strange to picture, but it was seriously considered. Here's another one that most fans have absolutely no idea about. That famous license plate joke in Up in Smoke, the one that spells out something inappropriate once you say it out loud, was not something the writers made up. It was real. There was an actual police officer in Los Angeles who had that exact plate on his own car years before the movie was even written. That's right, a real cop. Someone whose entire job was enforcing the law, drove around town for years with a plate that became one of the most famous jokes in stoner movie history. The plate started out on an old beat-up car, then got moved to a sleek sports car, and eventually ended up on a customized Volkswagen Beetle before it was finally retired. And get this, the original owner still has those plates sitting somewhere in his house today. It's one of those situations where real life ends up being even stranger and funnier than anything a writer could dream up on purpose. Now let's talk about something involving one of the biggest movie stars of all time. When Jack Nicholson came to watch an early screening of Up in Smoke, he wasn't in great shape. He had just been in a car accident that left him with a dislocated shoulder, and doctors had told him he needed to take it easy and avoid sudden movements. But nobody told the movie to stop being funny. Every single time a joke landed, Nicholson could not stop himself from laughing, even though every laugh sent a jolt of pain shooting through his injured shoulder. Picture him sitting there wincing and groaning through tears of laughter, unable to control himself even though his body was practically begging him to stop. It got so noticeable that the people behind the film actually started using his pained reactions as a kind of test. If a joke made Jack Nicholson laugh even through real physical pain, they knew it was a keeper, since no amount of acting could fake that kind of reaction. It became one of the strangest and most honest test screenings in movie history, all because one very famous man simply could not sit still and stay quiet. And here's a fun little bonus detail connected to that same story. The beat-up old Volkswagen Beetle that Cheech Chong drives at the very start of the film wasn't just some random prop picked off a studio lot. That car actually belonged to Jack Nicholson in real life before it ever showed up on screen. Here's one that shows just how differently these two work compared to what people assume. Their movie Nice Dreams, which came out in 1981, was based on a script that was only about 3.5 pages long. Not 30 pages. Not 300. Just 3.5. That's barely enough space to write a grocery list, let alone an entire feature film. The original idea was even weirder than what ended up on screen. At first, the two of them were going to play landscapers secretly growing marijuana all over the city while trimming hedges during the day. That idea eventually morphed into something even stranger, a plot involving selling weed out of an ice cream truck with a giant clown face mounted on top. But here's the part that will really surprise you. Even though the script was almost nothing on paper, the physical comedy was planned out in incredible detail behind the scenes. Every pratfall, Every chase, every slapstick moment was carefully storyboarded and rehearsed long before the cameras ever started rolling. It only looked chaotic and improvised because they were that good at making hard work look effortless. Behind that loose, chaotic energy on screen, there was actually a surprising amount of tension building between the two of them off camera, and it had almost nothing to do with drugs and everything to do with control. In his own memoir, Cheech admitted that the two of them were never really best friends in the way fans assumed. He described their bond as more like brothers, tied together by years of shared history rather than warm affection. They could argue bitterly backstage one minute and then walk out and perform a flawless routine the next, almost like flipping a switch. A big part of that friction came from who got credit for directing their films. Even though both of their names appeared as writers on all 6 of their major movies, it was Tommy who ended up directing 4 of them, and Cheech never fully felt like his own contributions were being recognized. That tension eventually boiled over during the making of Nice Dreams, when Cheech felt Tommy wanted total control over every decision, writing, directing, and calling every shot, leaving him to feel more like a sidekick than an equal partner. It's a strange thing to realize that some of the funniest movies ever made were built on top of quiet resentment simmering just beneath the surface the entire time. Now let's get into something a lot more serious, because Cheech Chong's story is not all laughs behind the scenes. In 2003, Tommy Chong actually went to federal prison. It wasn't for anything involving marijuana itself, but for selling glass pipes and bongs through an online business connected to his son. The United States government targeted the business specifically because of who Tommy was, using his fame as part of the case against him. He ended up spending 9 months behind bars for it, and by all accounts, prosecutors made a point of naming him publicly in press releases, essentially using his celebrity status to draw attention to the case in a way they did not do for other business owners charged with similar crimes. Think about that for a second. A man who spent his entire career joking about smoking weed on screen actually went to real prison in real life over paraphernalia charges tied to that exact image. It's a strange and honestly kind of sad twist, showing that the line between the character audiences loved and the real consequences he faced in his own life was thinner than most people ever realized. He later made a documentary about the experience, using it to speak out about how selectively certain laws get enforced against certain people, turning what could have been a purely painful chapter of his life into a platform for a much bigger conversation. Here's a fact that flips everything you think you know about Cheech Chong. Outside of comedy, he became one of the most important collectors of Mexican-American art in the entire country. His collection grew so large and so respected that it eventually became the foundation for an actual museum dedicated to Chicano art, something he had been passionately building piece by piece for decades, long before most fans ever knew he cared about art at all. He started collecting quietly, buying paintings directly from artists who had almost no gallery representation and very little mainstream recognition, long before that kind of art was taken seriously by major institutions. While the world saw him cracking jokes about getting high, he was quietly becoming one of the most serious and dedicated supporters of Mexican-American artists in the country, using his own money and his own name to help give an entire generation of overlooked painters a real platform they might never have gotten otherwise. Now here's something that connects the duo to one of the biggest music labels in history. Before Tommy Chong ever stepped foot in a comedy club, he was a working musician, and not just any musician. He played guitar in a band that actually got signed by Motown, one of the most legendary record labels ever created. Imagine that. One half of the most famous stoner comedy duo in history started his career playing music for the same label that launched icons like Diana Ross and the Jackson 5. If his music career had taken off just a little differently, comedy might have never crossed his path at all, and the entire stoner comedy genre as we know it might not exist. Here's a fact that connects Cheech Chong to a completely unexpected corner of pop culture, the animation world. Cheech Chong ended up lending his voice to some of the most beloved animated films ever made. He voiced the hyena Banzai in The Lion King, one of the most successful animated movies in history, and later became the voice of Ramon in the Cars franchise. Somewhere along the way, one of the kings of adult stoner comedy became a familiar voice to millions of children who had absolutely no idea who he really was outside of those characters. Meanwhile, Tommy Chong took a completely different route into animation, appearing as an exaggerated version of himself on South Park, poking fun at his own reputation in a way that showed he never took himself too seriously, even decades into his career. And here's one more surprising layer to Cheech's career that a lot of casual fans completely miss. Long after the stoner movies stopped coming out, he landed a serious dramatic role on the television show Nash Bridges, playing a police inspector for years alongside Don Johnson. It's almost funny to think about. The same man who built his entire early career playing a guy dodging cops in a smoke-filled Volkswagen eventually spent years playing a cop himself on primetime television. It showed a side of him that most of his original fans never expected to see, proving he had range far beyond the character that made him famous in the first place. And finally, here is the fact that ties this entire story together in the strangest way possible. After their explosive breakup in the mid-1980s, a split caused by years of built-up tension, arguments over creative control, and clashing egos, most people assumed Cheech and Chong were finished for good. They barely spoke for close to 20 years. But in 2008, after decades of silence and distance, they reunited and went back out on tour together, stepping onto a stage as a duo for the first time in a generation. Fans who had grown up watching their old films got the chance to see the two of them together one more time, older, a little more worn down, but still able to bring that same strange chemistry that made them legends in the first place. It proves something powerful about their story. Even after everything, the fights, the years of silence, the bitterness that built up over creative control, there was still something real enough between them to bring them back together in the end. So next time someone tells you Cheech and Chong were just two guys cracking jokes about weed, you'll know the real story goes so much deeper than that. A draft dodger who almost became a putter. A topless bar in Chinatown where an unscripted joke changed two lives forever. A studio that almost said no to one of the most successful comedies ever made. A Grammy-winning music career that came before the movies ever did. Quiet resentment simmering behind the scenes of some of the funniest films ever made. A near miss with a horror movie killer. A real cop's license plate turned into cinema history. A movie star laughing through actual physical pain. A 3.5-page script hiding a perfectly choreographed comedy machine. A prison sentence tied directly to the image that made him famous. A massive art collection nobody saw coming. A Motown record deal traded for a comedy career. Children's movie voices hiding behind adult comedy legends. A stoner icon, later playing a television cop. And a reunion nobody expected after decades of silence. That is the real story of Cheech and Chong, and honestly, it might be even stranger and more interesting than anything they ever put on screen.